We have finally returned.
The great chamber of the Vendrathi Council had not trembled with real fear in 11,000 years, and it did not tremble now, because none of the 9 species seated in its crystalline tiers believed a species so young, so soft, so laughably short-lived could ever make it tremble again. The chamber itself was a marvel older than most of the galaxy's star systems that had cooled and calcified into ash. A lattice of living quartz grown over 300 millennia by the Ithar cultivators, its walls humming with a resonance so old it had become silence, so present it had become invisible. Light did not merely enter that chamber. It arrived, was interrogated, and was permitted passage only after conforming to the ancient, ordered geometries the Council had spent an eternity perfecting. Order was their religion. Order was their law. Order, they believed, was the only thing standing between a young galaxy and its own annihilation, and they had appointed themselves its eternal custodians. 50 years ago, in Council reckoning a blink, in human reckoning a lifetime, Ambassador Elias Vanter stood alone at the base of that chamber and listened to 9 species pronounce his people extinct in all but name. The verdict was not spoken in anger. That was the cruelest part. It was spoken the way a gardener speaks of pruning a diseased branch, with the calm, bloodless certainty of beings who had judged 10,000 species before and would judge 10,000 more, and who had never once, in all that judging, been wrong. Humanity, the verdict said, was chaotic. Humanity was unpredictable. Humanity expanded too quickly, argued too loudly, warred among itself even as it reached for the stars, and could not be trusted to hold a single thread in the vast tapestry the Council had spent an eternity weaving. The verdict did not call it a punishment. It called it a correction. Humanity would be relocated, stripped of its ships, its weapons, its industry, its every device more advanced than fire and iron, and deposited on the coldest, darkest, most forgotten husk of a world on the trailing edge of the galactic rim, a place so far from any lane of commerce or culture that its name did not appear on any council star chart. They called it Kresnar. It had no prime meridian, no prime meaning, no prime anything, until humanity arrived and, in the black humor that would come to define them, started calling it Kresnar Prime. Because if they were going to die there, they decided, they would at least die somewhere with a name that sounded important. Ambassador Vanter was permitted one final statement before the verdict was executed. He did not beg. He did not rage. He looked up at 9 towering, ancient, crystalline faces arranged in their eternal, symmetrical tribunal, and he said only this: "You are exiling us because we refuse to stop moving. You should have asked yourselves what a species that refuses to stop moving does when you take away everything but its will to keep moving." Nobody in that chamber wrote his words down. Nobody thought they needed to. 50 years later, every single one of them would remember every syllable. The transport that carried the last of humanity away from Council space was not a ship built for dignity. It was a hollowed-out grain freighter, stripped of its transponders and half its life support, packed with 11 million men, women, and children who had, 3 days earlier, been citizens of a spacefaring civilization with cities among the stars, and who were now, in the flat language of Council bureaucracy, relocated persons of diminished standing. They were given no maps, no tools beyond what could be carried by hand, no seed banks, no medical archives, no weapons, not even the courtesy of a ship capable of returning the way it came. The Council did not want to kill humanity outright. That would have violated their own precious order, their own bloodless codes of conduct. They simply wanted humanity gone, and they trusted the Void to finish what diplomacy had started. The Void very nearly obliged. 50 years later, the Void's answer arrived instead, and it did not knock. Commander Sierra Vanter stood on the bridge of the second sunrise, flagship of a fleet the likes of which had never crossed the Council's tightly ordered stretch of the galaxy, and watched the light of 1,000 ancient, unsuspecting stars slide past her viewport like something out of a dream she was still not entirely convinced she was awake from. She was the daughter of Elias Vanter, born 9 years into the exile in a bunker carved from frozen basalt, raised on stories of a green and blue homeworld she had never seen and would likely never claim, and she had spent the whole of her 41 years learning, breath by breath, year by year, the terrible arithmetic of turning suffering into strength. Her father had not lived to see this day. He had died 11 years into the exile, in the second true winter, the one that killed one in Eve. Four humans still clinging to Kresnar Prime, coughing blood into frostbitten hands in a cave that smelled of tallow smoke and desperation, and his last words to his daughter, then a girl of 9, had not been words of comfort. They had been words of instruction. "Don't grieve us," he had told her. "Outlast them." She had spent every year since making sure she understood exactly what that meant. The second sunrise did not look like anything the council had ever built, and that was, in its own quiet way, the entire point. Where council vessels were grown rather than constructed, all soft curves and crystalline lattice, glowing with the calm pastel bioluminescence of things that had never needed to fight for their existence, human ships were forged, hammered into being across 5 decades of scavenged metal and desperate ingenuity, and they wore that history in every angle of their hulls. The second sunrise was a blade of black composite 3 kilometers from bow to stern, its surface not smooth but faceted, thousands of dark planes meeting at hard, deliberate angles, as though the ship itself refused the very concept of a curve that might suggest softness, might suggest apology. Along its spine ran veins of pale blue light, not decorative but functional, the visible skin of a power architecture that ran hotter and denser than anything the Council's gentle, patient engineers had ever dared attempt, because the Council had never needed to. They had never been cold. They had never been hungry. They had never had to choose between feeding their children and feeding their reactor cores, and so they had never learned what humanity had learned in the dark, that necessity does not politely wait for inspiration. It kicks the door down. Behind the second sunrise came the rest of the fleet, 400 vessels strong, arranged not in the rigid, ceremonial geometries the Council favored, but in a formation that looked, to any ancient and ordered eye, almost careless, almost chaotic, ships weaving and adjusting position in real time, correcting for each other's movements with a fluid, almost organic responsiveness that no Council tactical mind would have designed, and no Council tactical mind could counter. Because the truth the Council had never understood about chaos, the truth humanity had learned by living inside it for 50 years with no other choice, was that chaos, properly harnessed, was not the opposite of strength. It was strength's rawest, most adaptable form. To understand how a species reduced to 11 million freezing, starving refugees became a fleet capable of making ancient starfaring civilizations feel, for the first time in recorded memory, small, you had to go back. You had to go back to the black months after the transport ship crash-landed on Kresnar Prime's largest continent, a landing that killed nearly 200,000 people on impact and stranded the survivors in a twilight so deep and so cold that the human eye, evolved under a bright yellow star, took years to fully adjust to it. Kresnar Prime orbited a dim red dwarf on a long, eccentric ellipse, tidally locked so that one hemisphere baked in permanent dull crimson twilight while the other froze in permanent black. And the survivors, with no ship capable of leaving and no rescue coming, had exactly one choice: adapt or die in the narrow, brutal twilight band between the two extremes, the only strip of the planet where the temperature did not immediately kill an unprotected human body. The first year was the worst, and every human who lived through it agreed on that point even 50 years later, even when they agreed on almost nothing else. The wreck of the transport ship became the only shelter for nearly 250,000 people, its hollowed hull carved into makeshift barracks, its shattered engine housing turned into the first forge, its remaining scraps of composite hull plating melted down and reforged into the crude tools that would dig the first tunnels into the basalt cliffs that lined the twilight coast. There was no food that had not grown on this world, and this world, it turned out, had grown almost nothing edible by human standards. The first winter, they ate lichen scraped from black stone and a bitter, waxy tuber the children nicknamed graveroot because of where it was usually found growing, tangled in the roots of the stunted, colorless trees that dotted the twilight band, trees that had evolved to survive on a spectrum of dim red light and grew twisted and slow, taking a human lifetime to reach the height of a sapling back on Earth. Nearly 2 million people died in that first year alone, to cold, to starvation, to the crude, desperate violence of 11 million frightened strangers thrown together with no government, no law, and no hope beyond the hope they could manufacture themselves out of sheer, bloody-minded refusal to lie down and stop breathing. The cold on Kresnar Prime was not a cold that Earth had ever prepared them for. It did not arrive in gusts or storms. It simply was, a permanent, patient pressure pressing down on the twilight band from both directions at once, the frozen dark hemisphere on one side breathing its endless winter across the Terminator, the baked crimson hemisphere on the other side offering no comfort, only a dull red glare that scorched exposed skin without ever truly warming it. The survivors learned, in those first brutal months, to read the twilight the way sailors once read the sea, learned which stretches of the narrow habitable band held pockets of geothermal warmth bleeding up through fractures in the ancient basalt, learned which winds carried the fine, razor-edged dust that could shred unprotected lungs in a matter of hours, learned, above all, that the only rule Kresnar Prime enforced without exception was that stillness killed. A person who stopped moving, stopped working, stopped contributing to the collective, desperate labor of staying alive, was a person who froze, who starved, who simply faded into the twilight and did not come back. Children buried their parents in shallow graves scraped into frozen scree because the ground would not permit anything deeper, and parents buried children with a grief so total that some of them, the old exiles would later admit in quiet, unguarded moments, honestly expected the whole enterprise to end there, in a slow, unmarked collapse on a nameless world nobody in the wider galaxy would ever think to look for. It did not end there because of 1,000 small, unglamorous acts of refusal that no single history could ever fully capture. It was the woman named Priya Aditi, once an agricultural engineer on a world humanity no longer had access to, who spent 4 months of that first winter coaxing a single strain of hardy, radiation-resistant lichen into something that could be cultivated rather than merely foraged, laying the groundwork for the algae bays that would feed ashfall a decade later. It was a retired soldier named Tomas Krieger who organized the first watch rotations, not out of any formal authority, but because he had simply refused to watch one more person freeze to death on an unguarded perimeter while the rest of the camp slept, and whose stubborn, thankless insistence on structure kept the fragile camp from collapsing into the kind of desperate infighting that had already claimed hundreds of lives in the first chaotic weeks. It was children, barely old enough to walk, taught to scrape lichen from stone with hands wrapped in strips of scavenged insulation, taught before they had fully learned their letters that survival was not something that happened to you, but something you did every single day with whatever was left of your strength. It was Elias Vanter, in those first horrific months, who did the one thing that historians would later agree saved what remained of humanity from total collapse. He refused to let despair organize itself faster than survival could. He had been a diplomat, not a soldier, not an engineer, not a doctor, and he never claimed to know how to keep humanity alive on a hostile world. What he knew, the thing he had spent a lifetime among the endless, patient, ancient species of the Council learning, was how people organized themselves, how they built structure out of chaos, how a species survives not by being the strongest in any individual body, but by being the most stubbornly, creatively cooperative as a whole. He gathered what remained of humanity's scientists, its engineers, its doctors and teachers and farmers and soldiers, everyone who had any scrap of useful knowledge, and he built, out of the wreckage of a stripped-down grain freighter and the ashes of a species left for dead, the first Kresnar Council, a rough, improvised government whose only law in those early years was survival and whose only currency was contribution. Everyone worked. Everyone ate what the work produced. Everyone, from the youngest child capable of gathering lichen to the oldest surviving engineer capable of coaxing one more year of function out of a dying reactor core, was needed, and being needed, it turned out, was the single most powerful antidote to despair that any species had ever discovered. Elias Vanter's genius, if it could be called that, was never technical. He could not have built a reactor or cultivated a lichen strain to save his life, and he said as much, often, with the same self-deprecating honesty that made even the most exhausted survivors trust him. What he understood, better than anyone else who had survived the crash, was the architecture of hope, the way a species held together not by any single miracle, but by the accumulation of 10,000 small, visible proofs that tomorrow was worth working for. He instituted, in the third month of the exile, a practice the survivors came to call the telling, a nightly gathering in the shadow of the wrecked transport hull where anyone, regardless of age or standing, could stand and report one thing, however small, that had gone right that day. A tunnel that had not collapsed, a child's fever that had broken, a scrap of salvaged wire that had, against all odds, still carried a current. It cost nothing. It required no resources the camp did not already possess. And it did more, in the estimation of the psychologists who studied ashfalls founding decades later, to prevent total societal collapse than any single technological breakthrough that would follow. A people who could still find something to report at the telling, Elias often said, were a people who had not yet given up, and a people who had not yet given up were a people who could still be saved. He also made enemies, because building order out of chaos always requires someone willing to make decisions nobody wants to make, and Elias Vanter made plenty of those in his 11 years of leadership. Who ate first when the graveroot harvest fell short, who was assigned to the dangerous work of scouting the frozen hemisphere for salvageable wreckage from the original crash debris field, who among the sick was worth the camp's dwindling medical supplies, and who, in the coldest and most unforgivable calculus any of them ever had to perform, was not. He carried those decisions with him every day until his death, his daughter would later say, like stones in his coat pockets, and he never once let anyone see him set them down, because a leader who let his people see him break was a leader who gave his people permission to break as well, and none of them in those first desperate years could afford that permission. By the 5th year, the tunnels carved into the basalt cliffs had become something resembling a true settlement. 300,000 humans living in a warren of interconnected caves, heated by geothermal vents. The engineers had learned to tap using tools reforged a dozen times over from the ship's dwindling scraps of metal. By the 10th year, that settlement had a name, Ashfall, chosen by the children born in those years who had never seen Earth and never would. And Ashfall had grown crude hydroponics bays lit by bioluminescent algae the biologists had painstakingly cultivated from native Kresnar organisms, algae that glowed a sickly but life-giving green in the black tunnels, and fed, slowly, painfully, a growing population that had stopped merely surviving and started, for the first time since the exile, to plan. Planning in those years meant something almost unbearably modest by the standards of the civilization that had cast them out. It meant a council of elected engineers mapping, cave system by cave system, which stretches of basalt could support deeper excavation without collapse. It meant the first formal schools, held in repurposed cargo bays, where the handful of surviving teachers taught mathematics and physics from memory, because every textbook humanity had ever written remained behind on worlds they could no longer reach. It meant rationing boards that argued, sometimes for days, over whether a newly discovered mineral vein should be mined for construction material or reactor shielding, arguments that would have seemed impossibly small to the ancient, resource-rich civilizations of the Council, and that felt, to every human who lived through them, like matters of civilizational life and death, because they were. It was in year 12, in a cramped laboratory carved from stone and lit by that same sickly green algae light, that a physicist named Dr. Amara Cho, working with instruments built from salvaged sensor arrays and improvised particle detectors cobbled together from scrap the engineers had cannibalized from the transport ship's dead navigation core, first observed something that should not have been possible. She had been studying the strange behavior of Kresnar Prime's local magnetic field, an anomaly caused by the planet's unusually dense, iron-rich core, and in the course of that study she noticed something the Council's ancient, patient science had apparently never bothered to notice, because the Council's ancient, patient science had never needed to look for it. Under specific, narrow conditions, particles within that magnetic field appeared to tunnel across distances that classical models said should have been impossible, appearing on the far side of energy barriers instantaneously, with no measurable transit time at all. Every physicist in the galaxy knew about quantum tunneling. It was not a new discovery. Particles had been observed tunneling through energy barriers for as long as any species had possessed instruments fine enough to measure them, and the phenomenon had always been treated as a subatomic curiosity, a quirk of the very small with no meaningful application to the very large, because scaling that effect up to anything larger than a handful of particles required energy densities and field stabilities that no known technology, human or council, had ever been able to sustain. That was the accepted wisdom across 10,000 years of council science. That was the wall every ancient, patient species had looked at, shrugged at, and walked away from because they had never needed to climb it. They had their crystalline ships, their gentle bioluminescent drives, their comfortable, order-bound sublight and slipstream travel that had served them perfectly well for longer than humanity had existed as a species. And comfort, it turned out, was the single greatest enemy of discovery that any civilization could ever cultivate. Cho's laboratory in those early years was less a laboratory than an act of faith performed with borrowed equipment. Her first detector array was built from the navigation sensors of the dead transport ship, components never designed for particle physics at all, repurposed and recalibrated by hand across months of trial and error by a woman who had, in her previous life, specialized in stellar cartography rather than quantum mechanics, and who had only turned her attention to the strange behavior of Kresnar's magnetic field because the camp's ranking physicist had died in the second winter and anyone needed to keep asking questions or the whole discipline would simply cease to exist among what remained of humanity. She recruited her first assistant, a former graduate student named Oren Faisal, by offering him nothing more than an extra ration of processed grave root and the promise that the work, however hopeless it looked, mattered. It was the kind of recruitment pitch that would have gotten her laughed out of any council research institution in the galaxy, and it built, over the following decade, one of the most important scientific institutions humanity would ever produce. The years between the initial anomalous readings and the theoretical breakthrough were not years of steady, visible progress. They were years of failure stacked on failure, of hypotheses built and dismantled, of entire lines of research abandoned after months of work when a single contradictory data point revealed a fundamental flaw in the underlying assumption. Cho lost 3 members of her small team to the general hardships of Ashfall's early years, one to a tunnel collapse, one to a fever the camp's overworked doctors could not identify in time, one simply to exhaustion and grief. A young researcher named Ilsa Brandt who had watched her entire family die in the crash, and who, her colleagues later said, had simply run out of whatever it was that kept a person reaching for tomorrow. Cho kept working. She kept a private journal through those years, fragments of which would later be archived in Ashfall's growing library, and in one entry, dated to roughly year 18 of the exile. She wrote a line that would eventually be etched into the base of the memorial. The returning fleet would one day carry with it back into Council space. We are not chasing this discovery because we believe we will succeed. We are chasing it because stopping would mean admitting they were right about us, and I would rather die wrong than live agreeing with them. Humanity had no comfort left to protect. Humanity had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, and Dr. Amara Cho, working 18-hour shifts in a stone cave lit by dying algae, powered by a jury-rigged geothermal reactor that threatened to fail every single week for 3 straight years, did not have the luxury of shrugging at an impossible wall. She spent the next 11 years of her life, and the lives of a growing team of scientists who joined her one by one as word of her strange, stubborn obsession spread through Ashfall's tunnels, trying to climb it. The breakthrough, when it finally came, in year 23 of the exile, arrived not as a single triumphant moment, but as the exhausted, half-disbelieving realization of a night shift that had been running the same failed experiment for the 411th consecutive time. The problem, they had always known, was stability. Quantum tunneling at the subatomic scale was probabilistic, unpredictable, a phenomenon that occurred by chance rather than by command, and no amount of raw energy applied to a system could force a particle to tunnel on demand, only increase the odds that it might. What Cho's team discovered, in the cold hours of that 412th attempt, was that Kresnar Prime's unique magnetic architecture, the same dense, iron-rich core anomaly that had first caught Cho's attention a decade earlier, could be artificially replicated and amplified in a contained field, and that within such a field, tunneling probability did not merely increase. It became, under the right resonant frequency, something approaching certainty. They had not discovered a way to force particles to tunnel. They had discovered a way to ask the universe a question so precisely, so resonantly, that it stopped being a question of chance and became, for all practical purposes, a guarantee. It took another 14 years, years of failed prototypes, of small unmanned probes that vanished and were never recovered, of catastrophic field collapses that killed engineers and set human progress back by grueling months at a time, to scale that principle from a handful of subatomic particles to something large enough to carry a ship, and then a fleet. But scale it they did, because that was the thing about humanity that the ancient, patient council had never understood and in their comfortable, well-ordered arrogance had never bothered to learn. Humanity did not measure time the way the council measured time. The council's oldest members had lived for millennia, had watched empires rise and fall the way a human watches seasons change, and they had learned, across all those slow, patient centuries, that most problems solved themselves eventually if you simply waited long enough, that most walls eroded on their own if you simply had the patience to outlast them. Humanity did not have millennia. Humanity, on average, had 80 years, and every single human working in those cold stone tunnels understood, in a way no crystalline, near-immortal being ever fully could, that their children's survival was not a problem that could wait for erosion. It was a problem that had to be solved now, by hands that might not live to see the solution finished, passed like a torch from one exhausted generation to the next, because that was the only kind of urgency a mortal mayfly species had ever known how to feel, and it turned out to be a kind of urgency that could outinnovate 10,000 years of patient, ordered, comfortable stagnation in the span of a single human lifetime. By year 30, Ashfall had grown into something that could no longer be called a settlement. It was a city, sprawling for kilometers beneath the basalt cliffs, its tunnels now lit not by dying algae, but by cold fusion lanterns humanity had learned to build from Kresnar's abundant heavy hydrogen ice deposits, deposits the Council's ancient survey ships had scanned centuries earlier and dismissed as commercially worthless, because they had never needed the desperate, inventive fusion techniques that a stripped, Starving people would eventually be forced to pioneer, just to keep their children from freezing. By year 35, the first true tunnel-drive prototype, a ship no larger than an old Earth school bus, made the first manned instantaneous jump across a distance of 4 light-years, a journey that would have taken a Council slipstream vessel the better part of 3 months. And the pilot, a young engineer named Marcus Reyes who had volunteered for a mission everyone privately believed had perhaps a 1 in 3 chance of ending in his death, stepped out of that tiny ship on the far end of the jump, looked up at an unfamiliar sky full of unfamiliar stars, and wept because for the first time in 35 years, a human being had traveled somewhere that the Council had not first given permission for. The years after that breakthrough moved differently than the years before it had. Where the first 3 decades of exile had been a slow, grinding climb out of a pit that seemed bottomless, the final 2 decades became something closer to an avalanche. Each new discovery loosening the ground for the next, momentum building on momentum, until the trickle of innovation that had once taken years to produce a single working prototype became a flood that produced new breakthroughs by the month. The population of Ashfall, which had spent its first 3 decades focused almost entirely on the grim, unglamorous work of not dying, found itself, almost without noticing the transition, becoming something the old exiles had never quite dared to imagine again. A civilization with a future tense. Children born after year 30 grew up not with stories of desperate survival, but with stories of engineering triumphs, of Marcus Reyes stepping out of his tiny prototype ship into an unfamiliar starlight, of Amara Cho's stubborn, brilliant refusal to accept a wall the whole galaxy had agreed was unclimbable. And those stories did something the telling had done in the earliest years for an entirely different purpose. They gave a generation that had never known anything but Kresnar Prime a reason to believe that the rock beneath their feet was not a prison, but a forge. Humanity built its first true shipyards in year 38, vast open-pit forges carved into the twilight cliffs where teams of engineers, many of them the children and now grandchildren of the original exiles, worked around whatever passed for a clock on a planet with no true day, building hull frames from Kresnar's rich iron and titanium deposits, and powering them with fusion cores that dwarfed anything the Council's gentle, bioluminescent technology had ever needed to produce. The engineers who staffed those shipyards had never seen a Council vessel in person, had never toured a proper dry dock, had never been trained by anyone with formal experience in starship construction beyond what a handful of surviving specialists could remember and teach from memory alone, and so they built ships the only way they knew how, by asking, relentlessly, brutally, what actually worked, rather than what tradition or elegance or convention suggested should work. They discarded ornamentation because ornamentation cost mass they could not spare. They discarded symmetry for its own sake because symmetry, they learned through hard and sometimes fatal experimentation, mattered less than structural integrity under the punishing stresses of a tunnel jump. What emerged from those open-pit forges was a design philosophy utterly unlike anything the wider galaxy had ever produced. Ships built the way a fist is built rather than the way a flower is built. Every plate and beam and conduit justified by function first and only ever by beauty second, if it was justified by beauty at all. Humanity built its first war college in year 41, not out of any immediate desire for conflict, but out of the hard-learned, generational wisdom that a species which had once been stripped of everything by beings who considered themselves benevolent could never again afford to be defenseless in the face of benevolence. The doctrine taught there, developed by veterans of Ashfall's earliest security patrols and refined across a decade of simulation and theory, rejected outright the rigid, symmetrical tactical formations that ancient, ordered fleets like the Council's favored, and built instead around the same principle that had kept humanity alive on Kresnar Prime's hostile surface. Adaptability under pressure, decentralized decision-making, the trust that every crew, every captain, Every individual pilot could be relied upon to make the right call in the absence of a perfect, top-down plan, because no plan, however elegant, ever survived first contact with a universe that did not care how carefully you had ordered it. Humanity built, in year 44, the first vessel large enough and stable enough to be called a true warship, a 2-kilometer wedge of dark composite armor they named, with the particular grim humor that had come to define post-exile human culture, the spite, because as its chief engineer put it at the launch ceremony, spite was the fuel that had built everything they had, and it seemed only fitting to name the first true warship after the emotion that had kept a whole species alive. The spite was followed over the next 6 years by ships that grew steadily larger, steadily more refined, steadily more confident in their own strange, hard-edged aesthetic, until the shipyards of Kresnar Prime were producing vessels that no engineer from the earliest days of the exile, however brilliant, however desperate, could ever have imagined building from a hollowed-out grain freighter and the ashes of a dead civilization. Sierra Vanter was 32 years old when the Spite launched, already a rising officer in humanity's growing space service, already carrying, in the set of her jaw and the flint of her eyes, the unmistakable resemblance to the father she had watched die in a frozen cave 21 years earlier. She had grown up in the tunnels of Ashfall listening to the old exiles, the shrinking handful who still remembered the green and blue skies of Earth, tell stories of the world humanity had lost and the world the Council had taken from them, and she had grown up watching those same old exiles, one by one, die without ever seeing that world again, and somewhere in the long accumulation of all that grief, she had made herself a promise that she carried into every single decision of her adult life. That when humanity finally returned to the stars the Council had claimed for itself, it would not return as a beggar asking for mercy, and it would not return as a conqueror seeking revenge. It would return as something the Council had never once, in 10,000 years of ordered, patient judgment, prepared itself to face. An equal, arriving on its own terms, needing nothing from them at all. The final 6 years of preparation, from year 44 to year 50, were the years the histories would later call the forging, the years in which humanity, having proven its tunnel drive technology and its shipbuilding capacity, turned the full, focused might of a species that had learned to survive on nothing into the single largest coordinated engineering effort in its recorded existence. 400 ships, from the smallest scout vessels to the towering flagship that would become the second Sunrise, rose from the shipyards of Kresnar Prime in those 6 years, each one a fusion of hard-won necessity and hard-won pride, each one built not to erase the memory of exile but to stand as a monument to what that exile had, against every intention of the beings who imposed it, ultimately produced, the engineers who built. The second Sunrise did not smooth its angles or soften its lines, even though by year 50 humanity possessed manufacturing techniques sophisticated enough to produce the same graceful curves the Council favored. They kept the hard angles deliberately, kept the dark, unapologetic composite plating deliberately, because the ship was meant to say something the moment it was seen, and what it was meant to say was this: we did not become what you wanted us to become, and we are not sorry. By the time the fleet was ready, by the time the tunnel drive cores had been tested and retested across 1,000 jumps with a failure rate so low the engineers had stopped bothering to calculate it, humanity numbered nearly 30 million souls, nearly triple the population that had crash-landed on Kresnar Prime 50 years earlier, a population that had not merely survived exile but had, in surviving it, forged a culture, a science, and a fleet that no ancient, ordered, 10,000-year-old civilization had ever thought to prepare for. Sierra Vanter, who had risen through the ranks on merit alone in a society that had long since stopped caring about anything but what a person could contribute, was given command of the flagship and with it, command of the entire returning fleet. And on the day the second Sunrise lifted off from the twilight cliffs of Kresnar Prime for the last time, the whole of Ashfall gathered on the surface. In the dim red twilight their species had learned, against every odd, to call home. and watched 400 ships rise into a black sky full of stars that, for the first time in 50 years, no longer felt like a cage. In the final hours before departure, Sierra Vanter walked the length of the second sunrise alone, from its bow observation deck to the deep engineering sections, where the ship's tunnel drive core pulsed behind meters of radiation shielding like something more organism than machine. And she let herself, for perhaps the last time before the return demanded every ounce of her composure, simply look at what her species had built. The ship's interior corridors were narrow and unadorned by Council standards, lit by the same cold, efficient fusion lighting that had first illuminated Ashfall's deepest tunnels, and every surface bore some visible trace of the hands that had built it. A weld seam left slightly rough rather than polished smooth. A support strut reinforced with an extra brace because the engineer who installed it had grown up hearing stories of a tunnel collapse that killed 40 people in year 6 of the Exile, and had decided quietly that he would never again trust a structure that merely met the minimum specification. The ship did not feel cold to her, despite its unornamented severity, because she had grown up in tunnels built the exact same way, by hands that had learned, through bitter necessity, that a thing built to survive was more beautiful than a thing built merely to please the eye. On the bridge, in the final minutes before the jump, her crew moved through their pre-departure checks with a quiet, practiced calm that masked, she knew, an undercurrent of nerves that ran through every single person aboard, because for all their confidence in the tunnel drive technology, for all the hundreds of successful jumps that had proven the science sound, none of them had ever attempted a jump of this scale, across this distance, into space controlled by the very civilization that had once declared their entire species unfit to exist. Divan Akoy ran a final diagnostic on the tactical array, his jaw set in the same hard line his grandmother's old photographs showed on her own face in the years before the crash. The ship's chief engineer, a quiet, meticulous woman named Yuki Tanaka, whose parents had been among the first generation born in Ashfall's tunnels, monitored the containment field readings on the tunnel drive core with the focused intensity of someone who understood, better than almost anyone aboard, exactly how much could go wrong if that field so much as flickered during transit. Field stability at 99.98%, Tanaka reported. Core resonance locked. We are ready, Commander. Sierra Vanter looked out at the black, star-flecked emptiness of the galactic rim one last time, the same dark, forgotten stretch of space that had swallowed her species 50 years earlier and had, against every intention of the beings who exiled them there, given that species everything it needed to become something new. Then let's go home, she said, and let them see exactly what home built. The jump back into Council space took 4 minutes. It had taken humanity's ancestors nearly a year of desperate, half-broken transit to reach Kresnar Prime in the first place, crammed into a dying freighter with no navigation and no hope. It took their children, 50 years later, 4 minutes, and Sierra Vanter stood on the bridge of the second sunrise as the tunnel field collapsed. Around the fleet and the black, empty stretch of the galactic rim was replaced, in an instant, with the crowded, star-thick heart of Council space, and she felt something in her chest that she had spent 30 years training herself not to feel in front of her crew, and let herself feel anyway, just for a moment, because some moments earned it. The first Council vessel to detect the fleet's arrival was a Ithar science cruiser, a slow, graceful thing of pale-grown crystal that had been idling in a quiet system doing nothing more urgent than routine stellar cartography, and its sensor operators very nearly dismissed the readings as an instrument malfunction, because nothing in the whole of the Council's 10,000-year sensor archive had ever recorded 400 vessels appearing from absolutely nowhere, with no slipstream signature. No gravitic wake, no warning of any kind, simply blinking into existence in the space of a single sensor sweep, as though they had always been there, and reality itself had only just gotten around to admitting it. The cruiser's captain, an elder of considerable standing named Thessaly spent nearly 11 minutes refusing to believe her own instruments, running diagnostic after diagnostic, because the alternative, the possibility that some unknown fleet possessed a means of travel that left no trace and required no transit time at all, was not merely alarming. It was, to a mind steeped in 10,000 years of ordered, patient council science, close to incomprehensible. Word reached the council chamber within the hour, and it reached them wrapped in a confusion that quickly curdled into something the ancient species assembled there had not felt collectively in longer than their oldest members could remember: uncertainty. The 9 seats of the council convened in emergency session, their crystalline chamber humming with an anxious dissonance utterly unlike its usual serene, ordered tone, and the first proposal raised, inevitably, was military. Dispatch the Sentinel Armada, the standing defensive fleet the Council had maintained for millennia as the final guarantor of galactic order, and intercept the unknown incursion before it could reach Council Space's inhabited core. It was Elder Thessaly herself, still shaken from her own encounter, who raised the objection that gave the whole chamber pause. The fleet's ships, she reported, matched no known configuration in any archive, but their hull markings, faint and half-obscured by battle-worn plating, matched a species classification retired from active council records 50 years earlier. Species classification: human. Status: exiled, presumed extinct. The chamber fell silent, in a way it had not fallen silent in 11,000 years. The Sentinel Armada launched anyway, because, whatever uncertainty gripped the Council's political chamber, the Council's military doctrine had never once in its long history hesitated to answer an unidentified incursion with overwhelming, ordered force, and doctrine, unlike diplomacy, did not pause to ask questions before acting. 300 vessels of the Sentinel Armada, ships of pale, grown crystal armed with resonance cannons that could shatter a moon and shielded by harmonic fields that had not been meaningfully breached in over 4,000 years of recorded conflict, moved to intercept the human fleet at the edge of the Varen expanse, a broad, empty stretch of interstellar space that formed the natural approach corridor to the Council's inhabited core worlds, and arrayed themselves in the wide, elegant, mathematically perfect defensive crescent that Council tactical doctrine had employed, essentially unchanged, for over 6,000 years, a formation designed to funnel any approaching force into a killing field of overlapping resonance fire from which no vessel had ever escaped. The visual contrast, when the two fleets finally came within sight of one another across the vast dark stretch of the Varen expanse, was the kind of thing that would be replayed, painted, and rendered in 1,000 different forms across the galaxy for generations to come. The Sentinel Armada hung in its wide, perfect crescent like a necklace of pale, glowing gemstones strung across the void, 300 vessels of grown crystal catching and refracting the light of a distant star into soft, shifting halos of blue and violet and gold, every ship a masterwork of patient, organic growth, cultivated rather than built, curved and luminous and utterly, serenely beautiful in the way that only something with absolutely nothing left to prove could afford to be. Against that backdrop, the human fleet approached like a tear in the fabric of the scene, 400 ships of dark, faceted composite that drank the starlight rather than reflecting it, their hulls threaded with narrow veins of hard blue light that pulsed not with the gentle, ambient rhythm of the Council's bioluminescent drives, but with the harder, more argent cadence of reactors running at the very edge of what their containment could bear. Where the Sentinel Armada looked like something grown in a garden tended for 10,000 years, the human fleet looked like something forged in a furnace that had never once been allowed to cool, and against a council culture that had spent its entire existence equating beauty with order and order with virtue. That stark, deliberate ugliness was its own kind of statement, spoken not in words but in silhouette. Sierra Vanter watched that crescent take shape on the second, Sunrise's tactical display, with an expression her crew would later describe as something disturbingly close to amusement. "They're going to try to make us go around them," said her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Divan Akoy, whose grandmother had died in Kresnar Prime's first winter, and who had spent his entire adult life training for a moment he had honestly never expected to arrive. "They think there's a such thing as a round for us," Sira said, and there was no cruelty in her voice when she said it, only a kind of tired, hard-won pity for beings who had never once been forced to imagine a universe that did not obey their rules. "Signal the fleet. Formation Ashfall. Nobody fires first. Nobody fires at all unless they do." The Sentinel Armada's crescent held its perfect, patient formation as the human fleet closed the distance, its commanders confident, as 10,000 years of unbroken precedent had taught them to be confident, that no vessel in the galaxy possessed the acceleration or the maneuverability to avoid the overlapping fields of resonance fire that would engulf any ship attempting to pass through their line. They watched the human fleet's approach vector with the calm, unhurried certainty of beings who had never lost a battle they had time to prepare for, and they held that certainty right up until the moment the entire human fleet, 400 ships strong, vanished from their sensors 30 kilometers short of the engagement line and reappeared, in the same silent, trackless instant, 11,000 kilometers beyond the crescent's far edge, already reforming their travel formation as though the 300 assembled warships of the Sentinel Armada, the pride and guarantee of 11 millennia of Council military supremacy, simply did not exist. There was no explosion, no weapons fire, no triumphant human broadcast taunting the Armada they had just rendered utterly, humiliatingly irrelevant. That, Sira Vanter had decided long before the fleet ever left Kresnar Prime, was precisely the point. Humanity had not returned to prove it could destroy the Council's ships. Any fleet with enough firepower could destroy ships. That was a currency the Council itself had traded in for millennia, and Sira refused to buy her species' return with a currency that would only confirm every fear the Council had ever held about human chaos and human violence. She had returned to prove something far more devastating, to a civilization that had built its entire 10,000-year identity on the unshakable certainty of its own supremacy. That the crescent, the doctrine, the resonance cannons, the harmonic shields, the whole vast and ancient architecture of Council military might, could simply be rendered meaningless, bypassed as effortlessly as a river bypasses a stone too stubborn to move out of its way. And there was nothing, nothing at all, that 10,000 years of patient, ordered strength could do about it. The Sentinel Armada's commander, an old and deeply decorated warrior of the Krithian bloodline named High Marshal Osrin Vec, sat in stunned, furious silence in his flagship's command sanctum for nearly 2 full minutes after the human fleet vanished from his tactical display. And in that silence, something the Council's military doctrine had never once been designed to account for began, slowly and unwillingly, to take root in his ancient mind. The possibility that the order he had spent 400 years of his long life serving was not, in fact, the unshakable, eternal law of the galaxy he had always believed it to be. It was simply the oldest habit in a very old room, and habits, no matter how old, could be broken by anyone patient enough, desperate enough, or simply stubborn enough to refuse to accept them. The human fleet did not stop at the Varen expanse. It continued on, unhurried, its formation loose and fluid and utterly unbothered, toward the crystalline heart of Council space itself, toward the ancient homeworld system where the Great Chamber stood, and word of its coming arrived ahead of it, carried by the panicked, disbelieving reports of a Sentinel Armada that had been rendered obsolete in the space of a single silent maneuver. And by the time the second sunrise and its 399 companion vessels emerged from their final tunnel jump directly above the Council homeworld, close enough that its crystalline capital cities glittered on the surface like scattered, ancient jewels, the entire Council, all 9 species, all 9 seats, had already assembled in the great chamber, because there was, for the first time in the memory of any being present, genuinely nowhere else they could imagine being. Sira Vanter took a single shuttle down to the surface, escorted by nothing more than a small honor guard, because she understood, with the same hard-won clarity that had guided every decision of the return, that arriving with an army at her back would only confirm the very chaos the Council had exiled her species for 50 years earlier, and that was not the message she carried. She walked into the great chamber alone, past towering crystalline walls that had judged and exiled 10,000 species before hers, and she stood at the exact spot on the chamber floor where her father had stood 50 years earlier and heard his species condemned to a slow, forgotten death. And she looked up at 9 ancient, ordered faces that had not, in the whole of their long and patient existence, ever once had to look down at a species they had wronged and find themselves, for the first time, uncertain of their own footing. 50 years ago, Sira said, and her voice did not shake because she had spent 30 years of her life making sure it never would. You stood exactly where I am standing and told my father that humanity was too chaotic, too unpredictable, too dangerous to be trusted with a place among the ordered species of this galaxy. You took our ships. You took our tools. You took everything but our will to keep breathing, and you left us on a rock at the edge of the dark to die quietly, so you would never have to think about us again. She let the silence sit there for a moment, let it stretch long enough that even the most patient, ancient minds in that chamber felt its full weight. We did not die quietly. We built a civilization out of frozen stone and scavenged metal. We built a science your own scholars told my father was impossible, using tools you would have called primitive, powered by desperation you have never once had to feel in 10,000 years of comfort. We just crossed more of this galaxy in 4 minutes than your entire Sentinel armada could cross in 4 months, and we did it without firing a single shot, because we did not come here for war. We did not come here for revenge, though every single one of us would have been entitled to want it. We came here to stand in this exact chamber and let you look with your own ancient eyes at what your order has done. You did not destroy us. You forged us. And now you have to decide, all 9 of you, what you intend to do with a species you can no longer outrun, outbuild, or outlast. No one in the great chamber spoke for a very long time. One of the 9 seated elders, an ancient Krithian jurist named Vasek Thane, who had personally cast the deciding vote in Elias Vanter's exile 50 years earlier, and who had, in all the decades since, never once revisited that judgment in his own mind, finally broke the silence with a question rather than a statement, because in 10,000 years of presiding over the fate of lesser species, he had never once needed to ask a question he did not already know the answer to. "What do you want from us?" he said, and his voice, though still carrying the deep, resonant authority the chamber's crystalline architecture lent to every voice within it, had lost some of the flat, bloodless certainty it had carried 50 years earlier. "Territory, reparation, a seat at this table. Name it, and this council will convene to consider it as is proper." "You still think this is about what we want from you," Sira said, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, something sharper than composure moved behind her eyes. "That's the mistake you made 50 years ago, and it's the mistake you're making right now. You keep asking what we want, because in 10,000 years, every species that has ever stood where I am standing has wanted something from you. Your protection, your technology, your approval, your permission to simply exist within the order you've spent an eternity building. We didn't come back today to ask for any of that. We came back because you took everything you thought a species needed to survive, and it turned out you were wrong about what that actually was. You thought we needed your ships. We built better ones out of scrap metal and desperation. You thought we needed your permission to travel this galaxy. We found a door you never even knew existed and walked through it without asking. The only thing you actually gave us, the only thing that mattered, was the one thing you meant as a punishment. 50 years alone, with nothing to rely on but each other. And it turns out that was the only ingredient we were ever missing." The chamber's crystalline walls hummed faintly, the ambient resonance that council architects had spent millennia perfecting, shifting, almost imperceptibly, into something that no council scholar present could quite name, because the chamber had never before been forced to hold a silence shaped quite like this one. Vasek Thane, the old jurist who had voted for exile 50 years earlier, sat motionless in his crystalline seat for a long moment, his ancient, deep-set eyes fixed on the young human commander standing exactly where her father had once stood to hear his species condemned. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to the chamber and not to protocol, but directly to her. "Your father," he said slowly, "told this chamber that a species which refuses to stop moving cannot be stopped by taking away everything but its will to move. I remember thinking at the time that it was the kind of thing a desperate man says when he has run out of arguments. I have had 50 years to reconsider that assessment. I confess I did not expect to need all 50 of them." It was Elder Thessaly Orr, the Ithar cruiser captain whose disbelieving sensor readings had first announced humanity's return, who spoke next, because she had spent the longest of anyone present looking directly at the evidence of what her civilization's comfortable, patient order had failed in 10,000 years to imagine. 50 years, she said quietly, in the slow, resonant cadence of her people, and you did what we could not do in 10,000. It was not quite an apology. The Council, in all its ancient, ordered history, had never developed a formal grammar for apology, because it had never before believed itself capable of being wrong. But it was, Sira understood, watching that ancient crystalline face for whatever it might do next, the first thread of one, and threads, she had learned across a lifetime spent watching her species reforge itself out of nothing, were sometimes all it took to unravel an order that had convinced itself it could never be undone. The negotiations that followed, when they finally began in earnest days later, were not the swift, triumphant reckoning that some among the human fleet had privately hoped for, and they were not the humiliating capitulation that some among the Council's oldest and proudest members had quietly feared. They were slow, careful, and occasionally bitter, conducted across a table that had never before in Council history been shared equally with a species so young, and they would stretch on, in one form or another, for months after the fleet's arrival, because 10,000 years of order does not unmake itself in a single afternoon, however dramatic that afternoon's opening act. But something had shifted in that chamber that no subsequent negotiation, however contentious, could ever fully undo. The Council's founding premise, the quiet, unspoken certainty that had underwritten every judgment it had ever passed, was that order, patiently and eternally maintained, was the only thing standing between the galaxy and chaos, and that the species entrusted with maintaining that order had earned the right to define, on behalf of everyone else, what chaos looked like and what became of those who embodied it. Humanity had not disproven that premise by force. It had disproven it simply by existing, by standing in the chamber where its extinction had once been calmly pronounced and demonstrating, without needing to raise a weapon, that the Council's oldest and most sacred assumption, that the young and the wild could not outbuild the old and the ordered, had been wrong from the very beginning. Sira Vanter left the great chamber that first day and returned to her shuttle alone, the same way she had arrived, and as it lifted away from the crystalline capital toward the waiting silhouette of the second sunrise, she allowed herself, finally, the thing she had refused herself throughout the long, controlled address she had delivered inside. She let herself grieve, quietly, for a father who had not lived to see this moment, who had died in a frozen cave believing, in his last conscious hours, that he might be leading his people toward nothing but a slower, colder version of the extinction the Council had already pronounced upon them. She thought of the telling, the nightly ritual he had built from nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to let despair win the day uncontested, and she thought, as the shuttle rose past the atmosphere and the vast dark curve of an alien homeworld fell away beneath her, that if he could see this, if he could see 400 ships built by hands that had once scraped lichen from frozen stone just to survive another night, he would not have called it victory. He would have simply asked what needed to be built next, because that, in the end, was the truest inheritance he had left his daughter and the whole of the people who had followed her home. Not the fleet, not the tunnel drive, not even the chamber full of ancient, humbled elders finally forced to reckon with what they had made. It was the simple, unbreakable habit of refusing to stop moving. Outside, high above the ancient homeworld's glittering, crystalline capital, 400 dark, angular human ships hung in silent, patient formation against the stars, their hulls threaded with veins of pale blue light, waiting not to conquer, not to destroy, but simply to be seen at last exactly as they were. Not the chaotic, dangerous children the Council had once cast into the dark to be forgotten, but something the ancient, ordered galaxy had never once, in all its long and patient history, learned how to build. A species that had been told it could not survive, and had answered that verdict not with despair, and not with surrender, but with 50 years of quiet, relentless, impossible defiance, until the only thing left for its judges to do was look up at last, and see exactly what they had made.